us today on both sides of the ocean. And I'm especially happy to see some faces from Ukraine as well. Welcome to you, and it's nice to know that you are safe. As many of you know, last year, as part of our 100th celebration, we instituted a series of panel discussions on very contemporary matters and issues, Ukrainian issues. We are now in a war, and I think that we are well into it, and it is time that we begin again our cycle of panels. And this year also with a focus on one-on-one discussions and interviews. And that is today what it will be happening. It will be a one-on-one discussion. The title is Russia's War Against Ukraine, What's Next? A very painful, but also very timely topic. We know that just barely the war began and President Biden of the United States offered President Zelensky evacuation. It certainly signaled what were the thoughts on Ukraine's possibility of surviving this war. But it has survived, and President Biden and Europe are very strongly now supporting the war with a belief in victory, or at least some victory. What will be the peace agreement, we do not know, but we're aiming and hoping for victory, a complete victory. The focus of this war, because Kyiv stands, embassies are returning, and the focus of the war has shifted from the northern to the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine. As we know, it appears that the Russian armies are trying to seize all the seaports, which would make Ukraine landlocked and affect its economy. It also appears that the armies are trying to encircle Ukrainian armies in Donetsk and Luhansk. And so, again, what can we expect next? On May 9th, we had hoped to hear from President Putin some indication of what would be next in his mind, in his plans. We did not hear it. We leave this to today's discussion to see what can be happening next, what are the possible scenarios, what are possible outcomes. Let me introduce today's discussants to you. Our chair and interviewer is Dr. Alexandr Мотиль, who is a former dean of social studies at the Ukrainian Free University and is currently chair of the political department. He's a professor of political science at Rutgers University. He also teaches at Columbia University. He is a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the USSR, and on nationalism, revolutions, empires, and theory. He is the author of many books, but I always try to highlight different books when I introduce him. So let me focus today on these. Imperial Ends, The Decay, Collapse, and Revival of Empires. Revolutions, Nations, Empires, Conceptual Limits and Theoretical Possibilities. And Dilemmas of Independence, Ukraine After Totalitarianism. He is also, I would like to note, editor of the Encyclopedia of Nationalism and the Holodomor Reader. And our guest today is Dr. Rajan Mennon, who is director of the Grand Strategy Program at Defense Priorities. And for those who do not know what Defense Priorities is, let me say that their mission, and I quote, is to inform citizens through leaders and policymakers of the importance of a strong, dynamic military, and to promote realistic grand strategies, prioritizing restraint, diplomacy, and free trade for security. Dr. Mennon is also the Anne and Bernard Spitzer Chair Emeritus in International Relations at the Powell School, located at the City College of New York. He is also Senior Research Scholar at the Zoisman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University, and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. Mennon has a long and very interesting biography, which I will not go on with, but anyone who wishes to look him up, please do put his name in and you can learn additional information about him. Among his published works, I would like to draw attention to The End of Alliances, which was published by Oxford University Press, Conflict in Ukraine, the unwinding of the post-Cold War order, which he co-authored with Eugene Rumer, and The Conceit of Humanitarian Intervention. He is preparing a book, which is under contract, on Russia after Putin. So I will leave you with this very intriguing title of the book and intriguing thought of Russia after Putin, and invite our discussants to please take the floor. Dr. Мотиль, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prishlak, for that lovely introduction. I've known Dr. Menon, or Raj Menon, for close to 40 years. And we often converse, and what you're about to experience will be one of our many conversations. We're usually more or less on the same page. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree, but we're always very civil about it. So you'll be witnessing a civil exchange of ideas regarding the current war in Ukraine. But mostly you'll be hearing Dr. Menon, because of course he is the guest and he has very interesting things to tell us about the war as well as about war in general. Let's just start with the obvious question. What's your assessment of the current situation? How do you, who's winning, who's losing? Is it a stalemate? And what do you see is happening within the next few weeks?
Thanks very much, Alex. I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Prishlak for inviting me and putting this panel together. And it's good to have yet another round of our conversation. What is my assessment? The one thing to note, and you and I have talked about this war has upended or falsified just about every prediction that everybody had, including, I think, American intelligence, except for one thing. They did expect a full-blown invasion. I think the general sense, and Professor Prishlak alluded to this earlier, was that the Ukrainian army would very quickly be overcome. I think that was Putin's expectation. And I think he had that expectation partly because of the stereotype he has of Ukraine as a lesser people. He thought the balance of forces favored him. And I think he fully expected to be in Kiev in about 3 weeks. And I think he's gotten himself into a very difficult situation. Even if he, and this is a big if, even if he were to somehow eke out a military victory, for him, this is a strategic disaster. NATO is expanding with Finland and Sweden coming on board. The Russian economy is very significantly affected. The Russians are more dependent on the Chinese than they want to be. And much more importantly, this is the end of any kind of productive relationship between Russia and the West. I think until Putin is out of office, I cannot see any prospect for movement on things such as arms control. And I say that regrettably, because as problematic as Russia's assault on Ukraine is, there are important interests we have with them on areas like nuclear arms control. Now, very quickly, what do I make of the war? It's very hard to tell. The first phase, as you know, was from the north, and the Russian army failed. And it failed miserably. There were desertions. There were lack of basic supplies, ranging from water to petrol. Ammunition was insufficient. There were desertions, breakdown in equipment. And I think the Ukrainians were heroic in their resistance. So then they said, well, we're moving to a different strategy. I don't think it was a different strategy. They just realized that what they tried to do, taking Kiev and overthrowing the Zelensky government, was not going to be possible. So they moved to the east. And the belief has been that here they would have advantages. They'd be closer to Russia, shorter supply lines, it would be easier to supply troops and so on. But they've taken the same old tired troops and swung them eastward. And what I'm seeing is the same problems appear yet again. So that's the good part for Ukraine. The bad part, and I'll wind up very quickly. The bad part is, there is still substantial territory, Ukrainian territory, under Russian control in some form or the other. So Zaporozhye, for example, about 70% of the province is under some form of Russian control. The city itself is not, but Melitopol is, and Berdyansk is. Donetsk and Luhansk, I think since the war began, the expansion of Russian control, according to Ukrainian figures, about 80%. In the south, in the Black Sea coast, and Kherson to the north of Crimea, they haven't been able to move all the way to Odessa. And Professor Prishlak said their goal is to make Ukraine a landlocked state. I think that's absolutely right. Part of the goal here is to strangle the Ukrainian economy. I don't think they'll be able to do that, but they have, even without that, tremendous dominance at sea. And that's important because 70% of Ukraine's exports are seaborne, that is carried by sea. So this is still very much up in the air, but I think the Ukrainians are highly motivated. They're fighting on their home turf, and they're getting more and more American weapons. And the longer the time advances, I think the better they will be able to fight with those weapons.
Let's just pursue that for a second. I mean, the last point you made about the heavy weaponry that are coming in from the United States, but as well as from elsewhere. As you know, and just to remind our listeners, I mean, there was a very important meeting at Ramstein just about a week or two ago, at which over 40 ministers of defense came together. There's been a coordinating committee set up that will coordinate the deliveries of various kinds of weapons. And of course, Joseph Biden just recently signed off on Lend-Lease. Most Ukrainian analysts, indeed all Ukrainian analysts that I've read or heard, expect these weapons to turn the tide of battle, to enable Ukraine to embark on a major counteroffensive, and indeed, presumably lead to the withdrawal or the forcible withdrawal of Russian troops from the occupied territories. Do you share that optimism, or do you see some clouds on the horizon?
I think it's certainly a possibility. And you and I have talked about how difficult it is to predict this war. It would be foolish for me to say, well, I know what's going to happen. I don't. But could I see that happening? Yes. But I cannot see it happening anytime soon because the areas the Russians control are fairly substantial. Most of them are close to Russia or in areas where they have some advantages, like in the south, where they have sea dominance. But there's no question that the Lend-Lease program, just to give your listeners a sense of how significant it is, if you add to the Lend-Lease about 40 billion and change, and then the previous about 10 billion, that's almost the entire budget of our State Department minus the USAID. This is a substantial amount of money. And the weapons that are being supplied are weapons that the Ukrainians need to blunt an armored offensive. So anti-tank guided missiles from British and the United States. The British one is called the NLAWS. By the way, the Ukrainians have a very, as you know, Alex, a very sophisticated armament industry. So they've had their own anti-tank guided missiles. It's called the Stugna-P, the missile that hit the Moskva in the Black Sea may have been helped by American intelligence, but the Neptune was an American missile. There are Ukrainian drones, the Punisher. So the combination of drones, anti-tank guided missiles, surface-to-air missiles means that I think the Russians may take slowly more and more territory, although they're moving at a glacial pace, but they're going to pay a very hard price for this, very heavy price. And they have already.
Right. I mean, at this point, Ukrainian estimates of Russian war dead are about 26,000. About a week ago, Bellingcat said it's about 20,000. So, let's say it's somewhere between 20 and 25 or so. These are enormous numbers, especially when one considers that the total number of Russian casualties in the 9 to 10 years of the Afghan war was about 14,500. How long can Russia sustain these kinds of losses? At the rate they're going, by the end of the year, it'll be close to 100,000.
Right. This is the question, right? And we don't know because we haven't yet seen any significant opposition to the war that has forced President Putin to worry about whether he will remain in power. There have been some demonstrations, but by and large, there haven't been. Now, there are two reasons for that. There may be a lot of Russian support for the war. But I suspect the other reason is that Russians watch television news, and the Russian independent media has basically ceased to exist. So what they see is a highly sanitized view of what is going on. There are probably the bodies of young soldiers coming back dead. I don't think that, and this happened in the case of Vietnam and the United States as well, I don't think there's an attempt to really publicize the return home of coffins. In his speech, the May Great Patriotic War speech, Putin made a point of saying, we are going to devote substantial resources to taking care of the families of our war dead. So he's very sensitive about this. Now, what could change? And you and I have discussed this. At some point, if you have the mothers of soldiers coming out onto the street to protest, and again, I'm not saying this will happen, that's different from dispersing a crowd of Navalny supporters. Are you going to start beating up the mothers of soldiers? And then there's, of course, the war. How the economy, how much of a toll will the war take on the economy? And at what point will Russians believe that the war is materially affecting their state of their standard of living? And if you roll all that together, will that be enough to move a government that has enormous coercive powers? I just don't know, but it is entirely possible. And I think Putin is watching this very, very carefully. One of the reasons I think he's determined to somehow win this war is he has got to take home something that can be packaged as a victory. But of course, the Ukrainian strategy is to deny him precisely that. So that is his problem.
Well, what could he possibly package as a victory? Well, on the one hand, given the fact that he controls the propaganda apparatus, one could argue that he could package anything as a victory. He could even make up a victory, since many Russians just don't know better. But that aside, what realistically would work as a quasi-victory?
Yeah, well, he can package a lot as a victory, but not everything. So let me give you an example. If the war ended and all Russia hung on to was the city of Izium, he can't package that as a victory. What he can package as a victory, I think, is pushing the borders of the so-called republics, the Russian-backed republics, all the way to the borders of Donetsk and Luhansk, maintaining the land corridor along the Azov Sea to Crimea, and hanging on to the parts of Kherson that they've taken, something like about 11,000 square kilometers, and as much as the Black Sea as possible. I'm not saying that they will succeed in doing that, but that, it seems to me, would jibe with this whole trope of Novorossiya, right? This attempt to suggest these are ancestral Russian lands, and he can certainly spin that. But the war is not over. And, my sense is the war will go on for a long time. But that is bad news for Ukraine, not so much militarily, but I think economically. So I've been looking at some Ukrainian economists' calculations about what is the cost of rebuilding after the war. And they're quite similar to World Bank and IMF assessments. And as of about 2 weeks ago, it was $600 billion, right? That's more than 10 times Ukraine's entire GDP. And then, of course, you have about 16 million Ukrainians who are other IDPs or refugees. I tell Americans to think about it this way. Proportionately, that would be like 50 million Americans suddenly becoming refugees or IDPs in 2 months. There's not a country in Europe that's experienced something like this. It is huge. And so the question is, where will the money come from? Some people have said, well, they'll seize Russian assets. There are Russian foreign exchange reserves of about 284 billion that are out there. Can they be seized? I'm not a lawyer. I don't know about the legal intricacies, but certainly they're available. I suspect that the EU will end up putting a lot of the bill. And unfortunately, I can see a situation in which the poorer members of the EU who receive transfers because the EU is committed to raising the level of the economies, not to make them equal, but to avoid disparities, on the theory that if you have disparities, the EU won't hang together. They will say, well, if Ukraine gets this much money, will we get less? And Macron's statement yesterday about allowing Ukraine into the EU, I looked at it as a kind of an ambivalent thing. On the one hand, he said, well, you should have this ancillary thing where you have not full membership, but something approaching that, and then years will go by, and then there will be full membership and so on. So that's yet to be decided, right? I mean, I think membership in the EU would entitle Ukraine to substantial amounts of economic aid, because just reintegrating Ukrainians back into society, making their factories and their farms and their schools and their hospitals and their shopping centers, getting the economy back again is absolutely critical. And the longer the war lasts, the more the damage will be. That's the one concern I have. My concern is less military. Now, having said that, I'm not for a moment minimizing the number of deaths that have occurred, but I'm much more focused now on the long-term economic consequences for Ukraine.
I mean, in a way, it's a question of two opposing wars of attrition. The Russians are destroying the Ukrainian economy. Obviously, they're also destroying the civilian population. And the question is, how long can the Ukrainians last? How long can they survive that? And alternatively, the Ukrainians seem to be destroying the physical, the humans, the soldiers of the Russian army in fantastic numbers. And the question is, how long will the Russians be able to sustain those kinds of losses?
There's one big difference, right? The Russian military casualties, as you pointed out, are huge. Nobody would have expected this. 10 years in Afghanistan, they didn't have this many, and now they've got a much higher number. Ukraine, though, has suffered direct damage to its infrastructure. Let's take the city of Izium. The other day, I read a report that said 80% of its residential buildings have all been destroyed. And you can go city by city and see the same thing. So unless the Ukrainians take the war to Russia and start destroying Russian infrastructure in parallel, there'll be an asymmetry of the economic pain, it seems to me.
Right. So the Ukrainians are suffering primarily economically, the Russians primarily, obviously, though not exclusively in terms of human lives.
Just one point, it may well be that the Russian goal is, okay, we can't win the war, but we'll destroy as much of Ukraine as possible and say to the EU, well, here you go. You wanted Ukraine, now have it. That's entirely possible, because some of the attacks they've launched, for example, recently on Odessa, I mean, suggest a deliberate effort to destroy large parts of the country.
Right. Well, clearly, we've seen that in Mariupol, we've seen that in Kharkiv, and then, of course, in a whole slew of cities and towns and villages in the east, especially in the east. We have only a few more minutes. Let me just ask you, since this talk is about what's next, or at least that's one of the questions we promised to address, how do you see this war ending? You suggested it would take a long time. What do you mean by long? Are we talking months, years? And then finally, regardless of whether it's months or years, what are the scenarios of a potential end that you see?
You know much more about the internal workings of the Ukrainian political system than I do, but my sense is that it would be very hard for President Zelensky, after this heroic struggle, to settle for a peace deal that at minimum doesn't require the Russians to evacuate all lands seized since February 24th. That is when the war began. Crimea and the pre-war sections of the Donbass that the Russians controlled can be maybe kicked down the road to be decided by future generations. They can come up with some diplomatic language to massage that. But I think that it would be very difficult to sign an agreement that left Russia holding vast amounts of Ukrainian territory. And so that is why I think the war will continue. I don't have any idea whether it'll last months or years. Some have said even decades. I think that's an exaggeration. But this is in the end a war of attrition. And to me, the real question is, how quickly will Western arms shipments that have increased turn the war around in the Donbass? And is President Putin the kind of person who decides that he, out of sheer necessity, must retreat, or will he simply continue fighting the war, if necessary, not to seize territory, but simply to engage in vast amounts of destruction?
As you know, I've toyed with the question of whether Putin can survive. Might he be overthrown in some kind of coup or in a revolutionary movement? And of course, that's speculative. I mean, it's purely theoretical. But at the same time, there have been rumblings within the general staff. There seem to have been significant rumblings within the FSB, and of course, amongst the oligarchs as well. And one would imagine that if the war continues, at least at its current pace, with the continued huge losses and things like that, that sooner or later, those rumblings might turn into something more important. Again, whether it's a coup is perhaps irrelevant, but it's conceivable that the pressure on Putin to change course will presumably grow. I mean, as increasing numbers of Russian elites and possibly Russians realize that he's pushing the country towards oblivion.
Right. So if you contrast the probability of a bottom-up mass movement that overthrows him versus a palace coup, I would say the latter is more likely, and no one is more aware of that than President Putin, which has contradictory impulses for him. On the one hand, to try to win the war, on the other hand, to find some exit ramp or off-ramp where he can bring this to an end. But as I say, the off-ramp requires him to have something that he can hold on to. Just a word, by the way, about regime change and post-Putin. I mean, you may disagree with this, but my sense about that is we have to be careful what we wish for, because this is a country of about 148 million people, stretching across 11 or 12 time zones, and with large amounts of nuclear weapons and ethnically very, very diverse. And it has had in places like the North Caucasus ethnic conflicts already. So there are three possibilities. One is an other strong man, and it will be a man who places Putin, and he decides, I'm not personally associated with this war and I can withdraw from it, right? The second is that some messy transition to democracy. This is what the democracy promoters here wish for. The third, and this is why I'm concerned, is you could have prolonged violence, disunity, if not civil war, then upheaval in a nuclear armed state. And why is that worrisome? Because all of deterrence theory assumes that A and B deter each other, they have nuclear weapons, but they are stable entities. So we've never seen a nuclear weapon state in a state of turmoil. That is a world which we've not experienced. So the question is, how does that play out? And what are the risks and dangers there? So I'm of mixed, I mean, I don't have any enthusiasm for President Putin, but I'm of mixed feelings about this whole regime change business as an overt policy. If it comes about because the Russian people do something about it, that's one thing. But
I mean, my own personal sense is that the current regime is very similar to, I mean, in many respects, obviously not in all respects, but it's similar to that in the Soviet Union towards the middle and end of the 1980s. And again, my own personal view is that just as the Soviet Union fell apart primarily, if not exclusively, as a result of internal forces, so too I see those as being paramount in the possible bringing about of instability in Putin's Russia. Right. So whatever we want or whatever we don't want is in some ways almost irrelevant. Because our capacity to affect change in either direction, whether positive or negative, within Russia is really quite small.
Right. But that's just my point, right? I mean, we could see a process take on a momentum of its own that we won't be able to control from the outside, and it may not go in the direction that we want. Now, you could say, well, the same thing happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. You and I knew each other then and watched it. The difference was that you had in Gorbachev a leader who wanted to ratchet down the Cold War, and in President Bush, someone who did not want to use it as an occasion to humiliate him and to try to work very hard to make that a seamless process. And it wasn't perfect, but let's not remember that this huge colossus disintegrated with very little loss of life. It's an extraordinary thing, but I think you had leaders on both sides that were very careful and willing and able to negotiate this. I don't think we have that anymore, certainly not in Putin, and certainly not here, because I think here the mood is so bitter that the desire is to punish Russia as much as possible. And I understand why those sentiments exist, but it's a different situation than the end of the Cold War.
So let's end this on a possibly alarming note. And that is, you raised the question of nuclear weapons, and it's a question that I'm often asked. I'm always asked by interviewers, can I imagine a circumstance in which Putin would use tactical or strategic weapons? So let me ask the same question of you.
I mean, can I see it? Yes. Do I think it's highly likely? No. So yesterday, as you know, our Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, gave testimony. And I don't watch television, so I don't know whether she was asked about this or said it in her remarks. And she said, yes, we have to really be mindful of the possibility that a desperate Russian leadership might use nuclear weapons. Now, what kind of nuclear weapons? It would be, of course, suicidal to attack a NATO country, let alone the United States, because the results will be predictable. There would be retaliation against the Soviet Union, and Putin certainly doesn't want that. Tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, possibly, but to what end? I mean, what would be gained from doing that? Right? I mean, would you win the war? And if so, how would that translate into winning the war? And you have to think that even Putin must care a little bit, at least, about his legacy. If you invade a country that has not posed a threat to you, and then move to the level of nuclear weapons and use it against one or two big cities, I mean, you'll be remembered very unkindly in history. And maybe it doesn't matter to him, but I would think that it does.
One would assume that's the case. By the way, I have one final question. But before I do that, those of you in the audience who have questions for Dr. Menon, please write them down in the chat function at the bottom. I'll then read them and we'll proceed from there. Okay, let me ask you the following then. So this will be the final question, and purely speculative. 5 years from now, where do you see Ukraine, Russia, and Europe more generally?
Again, we've talked about this a long time. I've always been an optimist about Ukraine. It's a large country with a very highly educated population. The national unity has been strengthened immeasurably by the war. We would prefer that the war hadn't happened. It has now made a choice to move further and further toward the West. It will take time, but I'm not pessimistic about Ukraine. Russia is another matter because its economy hasn't become diversified. Everyone talks about corruption in Ukraine, but it's much worse, I think, in Russia. It is whatever one can say about President Zelensky, one has to be clear that this is not a political system that is run by one man, right? Zelensky could tomorrow decide, I'm retiring, and there'd be some process of replacing him. In the Russian system, it is a highly personalized system. So if Putin were to leave, to die, to be overthrown, everything is up for grabs. We don't exactly know what would happen. And that is not a good sort of political system because it's not institutionalized well.
I mean, I quite agree with you on that score. I mean, one would expect that if and when Putin leaves, either for natural reasons or for political reasons, there will be a power vacuum, and that power vacuum will presumably elicit some kind of power struggle amongst the survivors of the regime. And how that'll play itself out is anybody's guess. As you suggested, it could end up with a Putin II, or it could end up with a quasi-democrat of some kind, or a Khrushchev II, who wants to change the system and perhaps accommodate some of the fears of Russia's neighbors in the West.
Right. Can I say one other thing? I mean, I thought this at the time, but I'll say it again. In retrospect, I wonder whether it was a good idea for Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not in general a believer in nuclear proliferation, but what happened after that? Well, they had this Budapest memorandum, which was basically not in any kind of sense a military guarantee. And I think that sometimes the only way for a country that faces a dire security threat is to have the means to make the adversary believe that the cost of aggression would be very, very high. Now, I understand that the launch codes were in Moscow. It would have been hard for Ukraine to maintain the nuclear arsenal and so on, but essentially the Ukrainians were very cooperative and said, here, you can have our nuclear weapons. And one has to wonder, I don't know the answer to this, but if Ukraine were a nuclear power today, would the same chain of events happen? I mean, you know, you have great differences with John Mearsheimer, of course. He's probably a notorious person in Ukraine, but John wrote even back then that it would be a big mistake for Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons.
Right, right. Very good point. We do have a question in the chat, and it's an interesting one. What do you expect will change once Sweden and Finland join NATO?
You know, for Ukraine, not terribly much. I mean, it will strengthen NATO. My concern about NATO is that it's now a very large alliance. It's 30 members. And beyond a certain size, it becomes more difficult to get consensus on key issues. Now, you might say, well, but look at the war in Ukraine. NATO has acted with great unity and so on. Yes, but the numbers make it more difficult. So you have people like Orban in Hungary and others who, and I think even in some sense, Macron in France has a different view of what NATO should do and what the policy should be toward Ukraine than, say, the Poles. And the Polish position is not that it doesn't come from brotherly love of the Ukrainians. It's that they, you know, they stand to lose the most if Ukraine is swallowed up by Russia. For them, it would be a dire threat. And so they have taken a very hardline position on this. The same thing with the Balts, especially the Lithuanians. So I don't think it'll have much of an effect directly on Ukraine, but it is a disaster for President Putin. I mean, if part of the reason he launched the war by his own explanation is because of the fear that Ukraine would join NATO, he's now created a situation where NATO has been added to by two extremely significant military powers in Europe, namely Sweden and Finland, one of which their entire military strategy, Finland, is to prepare for an attack from Russia.
Okay, I see a hand from Dr. Antonovich. If you could ask your question, please.
Thank you so much. I listened and with all my ears. Thank you for your deep understanding and real concern about what is going on in Ukraine. First of all, I might forget, so I usually ask my colleagues not to use the word conflict concerning Ukraine. This is not crisis, this is not conflict, this is war of aggression, and which started in 2014, and in the full-scale stage of this war started on the 24th of February. I have two questions. One concerns Putin's speech on the 9th of May. We were waiting for this speech and it turned out to be nothing. So why do you think Putin has not announced plans or mobilization or something? Does it mean that he really, that he understands that there's no way out for him from this situation? And the second question concerns permanent membership of Russia in the Security Council of the United Nations. How long will it last? How long will Russia be a permanent member of the Security Council, an aggressor state, a terrorist state? Does it mean that the United Nations is powerless at all to stop this membership of permanent membership of Russia?
Right, right. I agree with you that we shouldn't use the word conflict, and I apologize if I did. I meant war, because what is going on really is a war. Let me take the UN question first. I think it's next to impossible to evict Russia from the Security Council because one country on the Security Council will almost certainly veto it, and that is China. I don't know enough about the inner workings of the UN Security Council to know whether there is even a process for removing a Security Council member. Now, you mentioned aggression, and again, just to be even-handed here, many people would argue that the 2003 American war against Iraq, Saddam Hussein was a bad man and all of this, but Iraq was not posing any threat to the United States, and we launched a preventive war of regime change without UN authorization. And they might argue, well, this is one variation of the same thing. Now, it's very different in this sense. I'm not saying the two are the same. So I don't think that's what will happen. I also don't think, there are two UNs, right? There is the UN that can stop wars. It can't do very much because it has no army. President Zelensky has been very frustrated with the UN, and I understand his frustration. But what can the UN do? He doesn't have any permanent forces to impose a peace on anybody. Then there's the other UN, the World Food Program, the UNHCR, and these other economic and social agencies that have been very active on the ground in Ukraine. So I think we have to look at what we want from the United Nations, bearing in mind what it can do well and what it cannot do well. And I think delivering a peace, it cannot do because it has no enforcement power. Even tomorrow, if you had a resolution condemning Russia and demanding that it stop the war, there'd be immediately two vetoes, Russia and Ukraine. And then what happens next? Is anybody going to volunteer, led by the United Nations, to go and push Russia out of Ukraine? No. So in this sense, the United Nations was deliberately created as a weak entity because none of the founding members, when a discussion was had about whether it should have its own military force, none of them, including the United States, wanted such an entity. That is an armed entity.
And Raj, the first question?
I'm sorry, you have to refresh my memory, Alex. I'm telling Professor Prishlak that I've got the flu. So if I'm not following the questions, it's not out of disrespect. I just forgot. Tell me the first part of the question.
The first concerned Putin's speech on the 9th of May.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, yes, forgive me. Okay. So here the question is, right? Who goes to Putin and what do they tell him? Do they say, Vladimir Vladimirovich, this war is not really working out? And if you bring bad news to him, are you going to be sort of patted on the back and told, I can only trust you, thank you for telling me this? Or are you going to be accused of being a defeatist? And if you convey bad news and the honest news, can you count on your colleagues to do it as well, or do you look completely isolated? Is he really open to people telling him that the war is not going well? Or has he convinced himself that he is this mythic figure and he can simply pull victory out of extraordinarily difficult circumstances? And does he have this kind of sense of superiority and delusion? I just don't know. I mean, a lot of this, I've even thought about, what has COVID done to Putin? He's been in this bubble for like 2 years. Who does he speak to? Who gets to see him? What do they tell him? He's got maybe data and information and so on, but does he actually understand what is going on in the war? He's not a military strategist. I mean, certain astonishing things have happened until recently when they appointed General Alexander Dvornikov, who used to be the commander of Russian forces in Syria. They didn't have a commander on the ground controlling all of their operations in Ukraine. Each group of the Russian military was reporting to a separate entity in Moscow, which is a completely crazy way of running a war.
Okay, we've got two questions, and I think I'll read both of them to you, and I suspect that'll be the end of our discussion, okay? So the first one is this: do you see any value in unarmed, civilian-based resistance? I assume that means peaceful resistance. And what can people in Ukraine do from this point of view? And the second question, would you consider a surrender of the currently occupied territories to achieve a temporary compromise as a realistic option for Ukraine?
On unarmed resistance, I'll make 2 points. There's actually a lot of work on the situations in which unarmed resistance works, and it can be a very powerful tool, because what you're basically doing in unarmed resistance is withdrawing complete cooperation from an oppressor and saying we will not do anything that you want us to do, and that even an oppressive force needs the cooperation or consent of the local population. And there's been already in places like Kherson and other places, Ukrainians coming out onto the street, even in areas that have been destroyed by the Russian army, and demonstrating and showing that they will not give up. But in the end, I don't think unarmed resistance is what's going to decide this war. I think it'll be decided, unfortunately, on the battlefield, with a lot of violence and a lot of people getting killed. The second question, I'm really reluctant to answer this, because it's not for me as an American to tell Ukrainians whether they should seek a peace by surrendering any part of their territory. It's just not my place to do that. Could I see a situation in which the tide of war turns and Ukraine is forced to make a compromise because the war moves in a direction that we don't expect and Ukraine faces some imminent defeat? It's possible. Based on what I see now, I don't see it. And I certainly don't see President Zelensky or Dmitry Kuleba or any senior Ukrainian official saying, well, we're going to start talking about compromise. And I think, if I understand them correctly, what they've said is the minimum condition is evacuation of all territories from February 24th, cease from February 24th, and they seem to believe that they can gain those territories back. The entire question is how long, how many people die, and what is the effect on the Ukrainian economy of the continuation of the war.
Thank you, Raj. I think we've reached 12:47, so we've imposed too much on your hospitality and your willingness to share your knowledge with us.
I should have been interviewing you, Alex. I mean, you're the expert here.
Well, maybe, maybe not. But we could do that. That's another possibility for the future. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank you above all for your willingness to participate in this event. And I'd like to thank all the participants, especially the rector, Maria Pushlak, for organizing this event, and for the participants for taking part in the event. And we trust and hope that you found this to be of interest, and that similar such events will take place in the future with your attendance. Dr. Pushlak, would you like to conclude the event?
May I just say before she speaks that I want to express my gratitude again, Alex, to both you and her and the 25 or so people who participated. It's been, I've actually managed to forget the fact that I have the flu, because it's been an interesting conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you again, Professor Мотиль, for kindly agreeing to be again the moderator and for preparing for this interview. My sincerest thanks to Professor Menon for his insights, which were provided a very interesting view. I think this is the first. The war continues. I think we need to, this was a beautiful inauguration. I think as we progress, we need to look at other topics that are tied with the war, but also with Ukraine in a broader sense. So I invite everyone to join us the next time. You will receive information about our series. We've begun the series today and plan to continue throughout the year. Thank you very much for your attention and for joining us today. And to all in Ukraine, stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.